In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, welcome, friends, to the 77th episode of Crime and Punishment, a legal podcast, not a political one. The official podcast of the Invictus Law Firm, PA, a criminal defense law firm in Orange County, Florida, the website for which is augustusinvictus.com. That is me. Yours truly, the host of this program. Today we're going to talk about alcohol. Your favorite subject and mine. This is America after all. So, I was at a conference this weekend, we'll call it Business Mastermind, right, that I'm in. Had an in-person seminar, workshop, whatever you want to call it. There's two things about this. One, I was basically instructed, more like it was suggested to me, to focus on Orlando. To focus on Orlando law. Things that are relevant here to criminal defendants, because that's what this law firm does, right? Is represent people charged with crimes in Orlando. So why are you talking about national, not politics, but national legal news that is completely irrelevant to people in Orlando? So we definitely will not be talking today about the J6 convictions for the Proud Boys last week. We will definitely not be talking about the text message I just received from a friend saying that in Canada, judges are directed to take racism into account as a mitigating factor when giving any member of a minority a sentence. Won't be talking about that. I got an article here. Wow. Well, I had an article, and apparently I lost it. But here's today's news about Orlando's alcohol laws. Let's check the chat first. Afternoon, everybody. So, in Orlando, they have passed these draconian laws saying that you have to get a new permit now. Everybody's got to reapply for this permit to sell alcohol after midnight because there's just too much violence. Everybody in Orlando is getting trashed at the bars. They're out till 2 in the morning. They're getting into fights. There was a shooting recently. This happens all the time. What's amazing is, don't you know that this happens all the time? Isn't that common knowledge? That hoodlums get drunk and fight? Have you never been to downtown Orlando before? Well, finally, somebody said, all right, that's enough. We've had enough. This shooting was enough. This is out of control. You need to reapply for permits, and if you're going to sell alcohol after midnight, you have to go through this whole application process. If I recall correctly, there were 67 applicants for this thing. I believe 40 or 47, one of those numbers. It was like an even number. Either there were 20 remaining or there had been 40 approved, but most of them at this point, 2/3 of them have been approved, it seems. There's some holdouts, there's some heartening cooperation between the bars and the law enforcement agencies. You know, that, well, you're in the application process. We're not going to come down hard on you, just as long as you keep it going. Great. What a great article, right? Unfortunately, I lost it. I can't read it to you verbatim. But here's the point. Obviously, crowds getting trashed in a close proximity to one another is going to lead to violence, especially with the sort of crowd that you have downtown. I don't even go anymore. It's horrible. I mean, you can look on Twitter and find, hashtags of nightlife in Orlando. It's so bad. It's disgusting what goes on down here. So they've always known. But now that somebody's been shot, well, now we have to do something about it, right? Like that's never happened before. No shootings in Orlando. Rumor is that Disney pays off all of these places that do these lists, like top 10 greatest cities with crime, or, top 10 happiest places to live in America. Apparently, again, rumor is Disney pays off these list people so that we don't show up in the top 10 crime cities in America. But if you spend any amount of time here, you will know that crime here as a business is booming. So everybody knows, if you live here, or if you've ever spent any length of time here, you know that there's a lot of drinking, there's a lot of drugs, there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of whoredom. This place is a cesspool in which we grew up. So now I've talked about the local news, I've done my duty. Let's talk about another thing. A return to chastity. This is in USA Today. From just last week or the week before. A return to chastity? ? Why so many women are saying no to casual sex. I forget which article this came from. I was looking at it was something sorted. And it was a USA Today article on this sorted thing, and it linked to this thing. The conclusion of the article is that there's a correlation here. Today's young people are swiping left on the idea of casual sex. In 2021, research from Rutgers University, New Brunswick, showed that casual sex has steadily decreased in recent years. Though many would suspect that this was due to the pandemic, or perhaps to the Me Too movement and these out-of-control accusations and horrendous things that are happening to men across the country, but that's not in USA Today. They're blaming it on COVID. The trend actually predates quarantines and shutdowns, and the reasons behind the decline in casual hookups differ between men and women. While factors like living at home with their parents and playing video games ranked as some of the reasons why young men were having less sex, and if you're listening to this program, I assume you're not playing video games, so I don't even need to say that. There was a clear main reason behind why young women were having less sex. Lower alcohol consumption. Wow. Shocking. Shocking news. The rise of concepts such as dry January, the sober curious movement, and the popularity of mocktails also indicate a cultural shift in the way we consume alcohol. George F. Koob, director of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, recently told USA Today. Put simply, since this generation is drinking less, they're having less casual sex. Imagine that. And that is more pronounced for women, who are more likely to express regret after a one-night stand than men. What does that tell us? For me, that is the writer of the article, not yours truly. It highlights the reality that casual sex and inebriation often go hand in hand, especially for young women. When sober, most women are less likely to be coerced or pressured into making choices that don't align with their true desires. Now, say what you will about the feminist, leftist bent of this writer of this article, right? The fact is, a broken clock is right twice a day. So when all of these women were upset that Roe v. Wade was overturned, that they can't just murder their own children on demand anymore, they said, you know what? Well, we're going to punish everybody. We're going to not have sex until marriage. How about that? What do you think about that, everybody? Well, God bless them. Oh no, don't do that. Anything but that. And here, these leftist feminists are saying, well, if we stop young women from drinking alcohol, then they'll stop being coerced and pressured into sex by men. Fine. Think what you want. Great. Do whatever you need to do to justify these intellectual acrobatics you got to go through. But if we're all on the same page about stopping this epidemic of women getting trashed and banging everybody in their vicinity, great. We're all on the same wagon now. Pun intended. Just like that 3 a.m. Taco Bell run, drunken one-night stands are often something many people wish they had gone without, especially women. According to a 2022 study looking at the emotional outcomes after casual sex, 46% of women experienced regret after casual sex compared to 23% of men. This may be more pronounced than ever before since many young women have lost their access to reproductive health care. Oh no! Well, then we should definitely stop women from drinking. Because now they can't have casual sex with no repercussions whatsoever. They should definitely stop drinking. I agree. Leftist feminist lady writing for USA Today. We are on the same page. Additionally, even with safer sex measures, women may grapple with STIs more frequently than men due to their anatomy, per the CDC. Amazing. This J.K. Rowling fanatic talking about there's different biology between men and women, such that women would suffer STIs more frequently than men. Amazing USA Today hasn't been canceled for publishing this opinion piece already. The aligning of the... No, okay, you know what? We're not reading that. This is a family program. Anyway, all that to say, okay, alcohol leads to violence. Alcohol leads to casual sex. These things are no-brainers to anyone who's been on this planet for more than, 2 decades. You'd really have to be living under a rock not to know these things. Thank God USA Today has finally caught on here. This is news. Like I said, this came out a week or two ago. There was a whole rabbit hole I had gone down because of this. Well, for some reason I got this harebrained idea. What happened in the Prohibition to communion wine? Right? Were people allowed to attend the Mass, the Catholic Mass, during Prohibition? I don't know. I've honestly never looked into it before. They couldn't possibly have banned... Oh, that's what it was. I read The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. That's what it was. And there was a whole series there. The movie For Greater Glory, the book Blood-Drenched Altars, all of these things about the persecution by the federal government of Mexico of the Catholic Church. They banned the Mass. They executed priests and bishops. It was a whole Freemason nightmare in Mexico. And you were required to swear allegiance to the federal government, and condemn the church. Anyway, so in America during the Prohibition, was communion wine outlawed? Turns out, no, it was not, because they needed the Catholic vote to pass Prohibition. And that is what today's episode is really about. Prohibition. I'm going to red pill you all on Prohibition. I'm going to introduce into this whole milieu the Prohibition pill. Why it was a good idea, why it should never have gone away, and why now that we've seen the consequences of repealing Prohibition, why it should be brought back. Toot sweet. To make this argument, I'm going to read you an article that cannot possibly be assailed. If you criticize this article or its author, I will charge you with anti-Semitism. This podcast is, by the way, broadcasting on YouTube. So if you engage in anti-Semitism on this platform, you will be removed. This article here is on jewishpress.com. Its eminent author is Saul J. Singer. And the title of this article is Jews, Wine, and Prohibition. I think this is a history worth knowing. I think that everybody should give ear to this eminent writer, Mr. Singer. And let's talk about bringing back Prohibition. Mr. Singer writes, Prohibition was arguably the preeminent issue in American politics and civil life at the end of the 19th century and through the first decades of the 20th century. Prohibitionists, led primarily by devout Protestants in the infamous Temperance Union, claimed that alcohol was the primary cause of public immorality, the deterioration of the family, rampant crime, and political corruption, and, accordingly, sought to make its sale and consumption illegal. Oh. Now, how could they ever come to that conclusion? We only addressed like 2 articles before jumping in here. Just anecdotal, Orlando's passing these new laws because people are out of control down here. And we need new permits for... Oh, that's the other part of the article. These permits, the application process includes having a security team and having them properly trained so that they can conduct pat-downs, make sure that nobody's carrying weapons. They have a whole security procedure that your establishment has to be hip to before they will issue this permit, right? So everybody knows. It's not like you need a study from Harvard. You know that all of these people drinking, it will lead to violence. There are fights. It will happen. Everybody knows that when people get drunk, they're going to have sex. If you don't know that, God bless you. I hope you stay at home with your parents until it's time for you to get married. You're an inspiration to us all. The rest of us, having to live out here in the cold, cruel world, know that these things are facts. You don't need a study to prove it, right? So to say that the Temperance Union and these uppity Protestants would make this claim that alcohol leads to all of these horrible things. I mean, we all heard it in school growing up, public school that is. These people were insane. They're bigots. They're Bible thumpers. They're out of their minds. You need a couple beers after a hard day's work. Wine is good for your heart. You should have at least 2 glasses a day. Well, it's okay to get, a little riled up on the weekends. After all, the game is on Sunday. Gotta at least drink some whiskey. Something with the boys. Gotta do something to let loose. Can't be so serious all the time. And, by the way, everybody knows that if you were to outlaw alcohol again, it would just lead to the rise of gangsters like Al Capone. I mean, look at the prohibition on drugs. Libertarians have been leading that charge for decades. We need to end the drug war because look at all the violence it produces. I know this because I was one of them. So it's not like you need some authoritative tome to tell you that the Temperance Union really did have a point, right? To continue, the 18th Amendment, which imposed a constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages, went into effect on January 16, 1920. Although it is impossible to know the exact number of bootleggers during Prohibition, historians believe that approximately 60% of them belonged to criminal gangs led by Jewish mobsters, including particularly Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who gained control of the beer and liquor supply for many cities. Non-gangster Jews were also involved in the proliferation of alcohol during Prohibition. For example, Samuel Bronfman, the Jewish owner of Seagram's, ran a bootlegging operation from Canada that was so expensive that Lake Erie became sardonically referred to as the Jewish Lake. Nonetheless, alcoholism was virtually absent from the Jewish community, consistent with Judaism's philosophy of moderation in all things. Not that the Jewish community would push poisons on this country, while they themselves did not partake. But that's the argument being made by Mr. Singer, this historical argument. Jews were generally staunch opponents of Prohibition for several reasons. First, they saw it as a part of a strategy to Christianize America by imposing both religious hegemony and racial purity on it, an effort that included ridding America of immigrants, including particularly Jewish immigrants and religious minorities. Many Jewish organizations, including B'nai B'rith and the American Jewish Committee, noted that organizations supporting Prohibition were invariably groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Protestant Church that sought to limit Jewish civil rights. Unbelievable. The Prohibition was pushed by the Klan. Is that galling or what? Second, wine plays an important role in many Jewish practices, and Jews protested interference with their First Amendment right to freedom of religion. Third, alcohol was big business, Actually, let me point out, let's back up a second. Wine plays an important part in many Jewish practices. They're talking about marriage, circumcision rites, Passover. That's going to be addressed in this article, because that's how I came to this, through this rabbit hole of banning communion wine. It turns out Prohibition did not ban wine for sacramental purposes, so Jewish opposition to it seems to be irrational. But let's continue. We'll get to that later. Third, alcohol was big business, and many Jews legally supported their families through alcohol-related employment. Thus, they saw prohibition as a serious threat to their economic liberty. This was particularly true of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, who took their distilling and winemaking skills with them to the New World and used them to legally support their families. Although the earliest record of the kosher wine business in the United States is the importation of 42 casks from Jerusalem to New York City in 1848, by the last decades of the 19th century, most kosher wine in the U.S. came from Eastern and Central Europe. Alcohol entrepreneurship was the exemplar of upward mobility and social integration for many American Jewish immigrants. Fourth, the production of wine was a Jewish tradition going back to at least Talmudic times, when wine, rather than water, was the staple at every meal, and because of strict kashrut laws regarding wine production, Jews often made their own kosher wine. Particularly to the 2 million Jews who had emigrated to the United States during the decades immediately preceding Prohibition, alcohol was an important part of their culture, and many culturally assimilated Jews worked in the liquor industry as distillers, wholesalers, and disproportionately as Jewish saloon keepers. Jews, who were about 5% of the population, were about 50% of the saloon keepers. There's a new statistic for you. 5% are 50% of the saloon keepers. The National Prohibition Act, known informally as the Volstead Act, was enacted to create the mechanisms for translating the intent of the 18th Amendment into functioning law. Among its 39 sections, it set up an enforcement unit under the aegis of the IRS. The act provided for several prohibition loopholes, including exceptions for industrial alcohol, cleaning products and the like, and medical liquor, which was an unmitigated sham because, as per the American Medical Association at the time, alcohol had no therapeutic use of any kind. Nonetheless, virtually anyone could purchase a prescription from his friendly neighborhood physician and obtain a script for the purchase of a pint of liquor every 10 days. The result was a sudden and unprecedented increase in illnesses, even epidemics, in families across America. It got so ridiculous that people began to say that a bartender is just a pharmacist with a limited inventory. You could make the same assessment of quote-unquote medical marijuana. A total sham. Obviously, the people in these myriad dispensaries across Florida, Colorado, Oregon, California, they don't have, legitimate medical problems necessitating marijuana as the cure. Right? Obviously, we're all just winking and nodding and, nudging with our elbows, right? Like, yeah, this is medical, all right. Everybody knows it. And Mr. Singer here in this article is pointing out that they did the same thing with Prohibition. Like, all right, okay, well, you can, dispense a pint of liquor every 10 days. How about that? This is, let's wink and nudge here with our elbows. But the Volstead Act loophole that was of far more interest to Jews was the sacramental wine exception. And what was almost certainly a concession to Jewish and Catholic critics, and to preserve the important Catholic vote and protect the act against First Amendment constitutional challenges, Section 6 declared, quote, "Nothing in this title shall be held to apply to the manufacture, sale, transportation, importation, possession, or distribution of wine for sacramental purposes, or like religious rites. No person to whom a permit may be issued shall sell, barter, exchange, or furnish any such wine to any person not a rabbi, minister of the gospel, priest, or other officer duly authorized for the purpose of any church or congregation. The head of any conference or diocese or other ecclesiastical jurisdiction may designate any rabbi, minister, or priest to supervise the manufacture of wine to be used for the purposes and rites in this section mentioned." End quote. Interestingly, the sacramental wine exception was far broader for Jews than for Christians. Christians were only authorized to obtain wine for their Mass and communion. public rites that take place in church. But Jews were allowed to bring wine home, which is the site of many Jewish rites involving wine. To facilitate governmental regulation of the Jewish sacramental exception, rabbis were only required to submit a list of congregational membership to government regulators, who would issue permits to individual members to purchase up to 10 gallons of wine a year. Admittedly, that's not very much. In early 1920, Orthodox rabbis Shalom Jaffe and Moses Margolis went to Washington to lobby Prohibition authorities to distribute sacramental wine permits only to the rabbis of the Union of Orthodox Rabbis. Lewis Marshall, president of the Conservative American Jewish Committee, successfully led the challenge by non-Orthodox denominations for recognition of their rabbis under the Volstead Act. The farcical result was a historic expansion of the number of rabbis and Jews joining Jewish congregations, never seen before or since, even during the yeshiva rabbinical deferment draft-dodging days of the Vietnam War. The Catholic Church was structured and hierarchical, making it relatively easy for the government to determine who was a priest. In marked contrast, there was no central authoritative Jewish body that could dictate who was a rabbi or establish formal qualifications for rabbinical designation, making such determination by the government regulators virtually impossible. Before the rise of new pseudo-Jewish denominations during the so-called Enlightenment toward the end of the 18th century, rabbis were ordained by their rebbes after demonstrating broad mastery of Jewish law and the requisite character traits to serve as a religious leader. Under Volstead Act regulations, all that an applicant had to do to receive a rabbinical license from the Department of State was to submit 10 affidavits, confirming that he was a rabbi, and not surprisingly, many people took advantage. 10 affidavits. That's all you need. 10 sworn statements saying, yep, this is my rabbi. And then you could get a license to get your alcohol. Many of these quote-unquote rabbis didn't even bother to obtain authentic signatures, instead taking names from telephone books, directories, cemetery headstones, and the like, or just plain making them up. One pseudo-rabbi, manifesting both humor and audacity, named his flock Congregation L'Chaim, the traditional Jewish toast. It's pretty funny, you have to admit. Some of these rabbis would earn additional personal profit by selling lists of their congregants, often to non-Jews. They're quote-unquote congregants, because they weren't actually real. Suddenly, there was a veritable explosion of Rabbi Katzes, Rabbi Epsteins, and Rabbi Rosenbergs, who could not read a word of Hebrew, had never seen the inside of a yeshiva or synagogue, and wouldn't know a Jewish law if they tripped over one. And quote-unquote rabbis arrested by Prohibition enforcement agents included Rabbi O'Brien, Rabbi Murphy, and Rabbi Gallagher. These bogus rabbis made significant money not only selling fraudulently obtained sacramental wine, but also their licenses, which commanded a very high price. The low likelihood of getting caught, and the relatively meager penalties if they were, only served to increase the growth of the American quote-unquote rabbinate during Prohibition. These sacramental exemptions led to broad abuse. For example, in 1919, the first year of Prohibition, one Los Angeles congregation boasted an increase from 180 member families to over 1,000 families. 5 years later, some 3 million gallons were distributed under the sacramental exception. And then there's a picture, which I wish I had downloaded, of a guy holding 2 massive jugs of kosher wine. And in the store window, it's just jugs and jugs and jugs of sacramental wine. And there's a massive sign that says, kosher wine for sacramental purposes, in big bold letters. And it's got this guy walking away with his 2 massive jugs. Now, this is New York City, of all places. Another example. During a 1926 investigation by Prohibition enforcement officials of 600 New York City rabbis suspected of inflating their congregation numbers, the distribution of sacramental wine fell from 1 million gallons to only 6,000 gallons in just 1 year. Thus, either the demand for sacramental wine fell by 99.4% in just 1 year, or there were almost 1 million non-Jews holding themselves out as pious Jews and taking advantage of the sacramental exception to the Volstead Act. The large role played by Jews in opposing Prohibition and engaging in bootlegging operations provided abundant fodder for anti-Semites, including notably Henry Ford, who, in his anti-Semitic rag, the Dearborn Independent, claimed that Jewish crimes against Prohibition were indicative of a general Jewish conspiracy designed to undermine American morals. Gasp! John Newton Tillman, a racist U.S. representative from Arkansas, referred specifically to distillers named Steinberg, Hirschbaum, and Schomburg while railing against Prohibition violators. One serious adverse repercussion arising out of the Jews' public and prominent role in violating Prohibition laws manifested itself in Congress's consideration of a highly restrictive immigration law. During hearings before the House Immigration Committee, various congressmen noted with contempt that Jews were among the foremost violators of the Volstead Act. The law in question, which seriously restricted Jewish immigration to America, was passed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority in record time. Jewish violations were particularly scrutinized and condemned by the press, with a spotlight brought to bear on the phony rabbis which embarrassed rabbinical leadership across all denominations. The Orthodox Jewish leadership in particular, horrified by the degradation of the Torah caused by the fraudsters, argued that publicly upholding Judaism as the religion of truth was more important than using wine at Jewish religious rites. To stem the abuse of the sacramental wine exception, non-Orthodox leadership, following a 1922 responsa by noted professor Louis Ginsburg, ruled that grape juice could be used for Jewish rituals instead of wine. However, as others have pointed out, this did not resolve the problem because there were insufficient supplies of kosher grape juice. Moreover, the virtually uniform Orthodox position at the time was that only fermented wine, not grape juice, could be used for Jewish rituals. That position was perhaps best laid out by Rabbi Herbert S. Goldstein, president of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, in A Year of Orthodoxy, December 1925. Where he ruled that even though rogues and villains were abusing the sacramental privilege, Jews should not ignore the imperative to use wine for their rituals. In any event, this prohibition, actually, I would agree with that, let me just say. If the Catholic Church were to say, you know what, we're just going to kowtow to the American government and we're going to accept that wine is just banned, and better not just, better that we use grape juice instead of holding the Mass, that we've been doing for a couple thousand years now. It'd be kind of like the Catholic Church saying, well, everybody should be vaccinated and we should shut down the churches because there's an epidemic going on after, by the way, a pandemic, mind you. That would be horrible, right? So I actually agree. This wine versus grape juice clash was an important development in the creation of an unbreachable chasm between the conservative movement and authentic Torah law. Sorry, buddy, that causes noise to go through the microphone, so that's why I had to take that off of there. The Reformed Central Conference of American Rabbis considered petitioning the government to repeal the sacramental wine exception, but ultimately opted not to do so because it feared provoking Christian clergy, who apparently were not as lenient as Reformed leadership about using grape juice for religious rites. Instead, they decided to lobby Prohibition authorities to limit Section 6 of the Volstead Act to Christians. But this attempt failed, and the abuses continued. Note what Mr. Singer is not saying in this article. That tu quoque argument, well, Catholics were doing it too. Well, the Protestants were doing it too. They're not even bothering to try that. They're saying, nope, these abuses were clearly all by rabbis and fake rabbis and, 10 affidavit rabbis and all these, Irishmen becoming rabbis, and it had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. The Christians wanted the Volstead Act Section 6 communion wine exception, or sacramental wine, that exception to be limited to Christians, but it failed. And legally speaking, obviously, that's going to fail. But anyway, the abuses continued, says Mr. Singer. By 1926, the Prohibition authorities had had enough. They voided all existing rabbinical wine permits and required all rabbis to personally appear before the local Prohibition administrator to justify their requests for wine. Can you imagine that being done in the year 2023 of our Lord? You must personally appear before the Prohibition administrator, rabbi, to justify your request for sacramental wine. Although the Orthodox rabbis vociferously protested, the new regulations remained in effect. Not surprisingly, the sale of sacramental wine plummeted. Throughout the Prohibition years, anti-prohibitionists, or wets, attacked prohibition for causing, rather than stemming, crime. Indeed, there was a direct correlation between prohibition and violent crime. For lowering local revenues, with tax lost revenue causing great damage to America's prospects for recovery from the Great Depression of 1929, and for imposing Protestant religious values on other Americans. So, that is the line we always hear. Prohibition caused, rather than stemmed, violent crime. After all, look at all these gangsters who only had businesses because of prohibition. Although he doesn't mention here what he mentioned earlier in the article, that 60% of these prohibition gangs peddling alcohol were Jewish. The same body of people whose non-criminals were opposing prohibition, were abusing the sacramental wine exception in the Volstead Act. But let's not talk about that. Lowering local revenues with lost tax revenue causing great damage to America's prospects for recovery from the Great Depression. So they do that same thing, libertarians. Murray Rothbard, and who's the other guy? Von Mises, those kind of libertarians. Well, if we would just legalize marijuana and tax it, imagine all the revenue this would create for the government. If we would just legalize meth and crocodile and everything else, imagine all the tax money. You'd be swimming in tax money. There'd be so many taxes. If you just legalized all of these horrific drugs that have destroyed millions, countless millions of lives, well, think of how much money the government would make. What an argument, right? Also think about who's doing the math on this, right? You're getting lower local revenue because of prohibition. Who did the math on that? Which accountant did you hire for this study? It's like the same people who say, well, if we integrate the races, if we bus children across, the state to different countries so that there will be an equal number of black students and white students, and blacks will be able to use the white hotels and be able to eat in the white restaurants, and nobody can segregate anymore, and we're going to desegregate all the neighborhoods and integrate everybody in the commercial activity of this country, well, that's going to create an economic boom. It's going to be good for business. This was the argument behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Who has done the math on that since? Third reason that the Wets attacked prohibition: for imposing Protestant religious values on other Americans. Don't forget that the Catholics voted for this too, but because the Temperance Union and all of these people pushing for it were Protestants, prohibition is imposing Protestant religious values on other Americans, namely the Christianizing of America, the protection of the racial stock of America at the time from immigrants, namely the Jewish immigrants, and keeping people from drinking and fighting and having casual relations, now that Cesare is awake from his nap. They finally won the day when, on December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, repealing federal prohibition laws and returning control of alcohol to the states, some of which continued to ban alcohol even after repeal. Mississippi, for example, maintained its ban on alcohol until 1966. Even today, many states have so-called blue laws in effect, prohibiting the sale of alcohol on Sundays, and the Supreme Court has upheld the constitutionality of blue laws several times on secular grounds, arguing that they, for example, protect workers and families and contribute to societal stability. Thus ends our illustrious article. So you have to wonder, all this they told you in school, public school, not Catholic school like you go to, Cesare. You have no idea how lucky you are. All this stuff that they told us in public school growing up about why prohibition was evil and how it bred crime and notorious gangsters like Al Capone. Notice they never mentioned Meyer Lansky or any of the others. Al Capone, that's what you get when you implement prohibition. And think of all the money the government makes off taxing alcohol. You're swimming in money. It's raining from the skies. There's so much money to be made from alcohol. In fact, marijuana is not nearly as bad as alcohol. Why don't we legalize that too? And then think of all the money the federal government will get and all the state governments. There's so much money to be made by legalizing these horrific things. Why not legalize gambling? That's not nearly as bad as... You can't even kill somebody driving if you're gambling. I mean, we allow people now to drink alcohol and to smoke marijuana and to eat it in edibles, and they're killing each other in car crashes. Why not allow gambling? Come on, think of all the money the government's going to make. Why not allow prostitution? You can tax it. It'll be safe. They'll get checkups all the time. And so on, and so on, and so on, until they chip away at every single thing you held sacred. And we were raised in school to believe that prohibition was insane. That all the Karens behind the prohibition movement were just notorious busybodies who just had to tell other people how to live, and they were just wrecking everybody's day. You gotta have a beer when you come home from work, after all, Karen. So, having read Mr. Singer's article on prohibition, on the reasons that prohibition was enacted, specifically the Christianization of America, knowing who opposed prohibition and why, perhaps you will all take the prohibition pill. And maybe we should bring it back. Going to the chat here, TBS says, Christ is King. Amen. Love is everything. Let's cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks, okay? TBS, he should just stream on GTV and go from 10 views to 100. Yeah. Yeah, being on YouTube is not helping anybody. Certainly not helping me. Seagram's tastes like cheap perfume. I don't know. I don't drink Seagram's. I don't drink anything. Anyway, gutting the medicinal booze, says Dry Ciders. Yeah, what a world. Anyway, so that's our lesson for today in law, the legal impetus behind prohibition, the new alcohol laws here in Orlando, and what alcohol leads to. And I guess that's it for today. So, next week, I don't know, talk about more Orlando news, just like this, everybody. Till then.